Hi, everyone. I'm Ravi Kapur. Welcome to the special swing voter panel we've assembled from folks all around the country, Indian Americans that have not necessarily made up their mind until really the stretch run here of this really major presidential election involving Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. Of course, Harris trying to be the first Indian American ever elected to the White House. And then, of course, President Trump trying to get back to that mantle. Both have made significant overtures to the community over the last couple of years. I had a chance to do a sit-down interview with President Trump. I've done some sit-down interviews in the past with Vice President Harris. So both of them very engaged in trying to get South Asians and Indian Americans out to vote. And so the three folks we have on the screen with us today are in swing states. Stan Kuravilla is in Pennsylvania, and an attorney, someone who sees all the signage for both candidates all over his neighborhood. We've got Shelley, who's in Wisconsin outside of Milwaukee, who is also seeing all kinds of messaging, trying to reach her community. And of course, now we have Mala Bajpai, who is in Arizona. She's also an attorney and has another perspective on the efforts going on in Arizona. So I'm very pleased to have the three of them on. They're all three of them are independents, which I think is important. But I do know we're here just the final few days, and so folks are starting to make that final decision. So it's really hard to find swing voters, especially in this race. And certainly we've seen the numbers over the last few weeks. We've had multiple interviews with folks like AAPI Data who've been cataloging how the race is going. We saw in the summertime when President Biden was on the top of the ticket, he had lost almost 20% of the Indian community versus 4 years ago. A pretty stunning decline compared to where the Democrats were in 2016, when almost 80% voted for Hillary Clinton. President Biden was down to 46%, and that precipitated, a change. Certainly, some of the polling numbers of President Biden look pretty poor, and so Vice President Harris has been able to grab some of those folks, and certainly it seems like she'll be able to grab the majority of the Indian American community. But I wanted to hear from these folks in swing states on the ground. So, Mala, let me start with you. You're in Arizona. We spoke just before recording this, and I understand you've made a decision, but tell me about your process of making a decision of who should be the next president of the United States, and what took you a while to deliberate on.
Well, I mean, definitely thinking about the biggest issues right now. I think everybody kind of recognizes this economy and immigration, and being in a border state, it took me a while to kind of assess both candidates. I think that I'm an immigration attorney as well in Arizona. So I saw firsthand, the effect of the Trump administration on legal immigration, which was really chaotic. I mean, there were hundreds of naturalization applications just thrown into a basement and not processed, consulates closed. It was really very debilitating as an immigration attorney. So I have that in my clear memory. But at the same time, we have this uncontrolled border crisis that's largely to blame, to Biden. And so I do see a lot of recent changes that have been made have been very effective at slowing down the border. But why hadn't they been made earlier? And why only in an election year? Why only months before? So I was kind of, on immigration, who are we going to support? Who's going to be more effective? And who's going to, make the biggest impact for both South Asians and just Americans in general. So that was a little bit hard to decipher, especially on specific issues like we know where kind of Trump stands in Project 2025. I don't have the same specifics for Kamala Harris. So that was kind of one of my thought process. And also in the economy, there's two very different approaches. So we have the memory of the Trump administration. My taxes went up, regulation went down, but at the same time, the economy right now, we've suffered inflation. Is it the Democrats' fault, or is it worldwide inflation? So that's kind of my thought process.
Shelley, let's hear from you in Wisconsin, which is a state that we don't talk about much for having a large AAPI presence, but certainly there's a growing Indian community there, and I certainly think Harris in particular has had a lot of support from women across the board. But you're someone that did not decide automatically to give your support to the vice president. So tell me about your process about thinking who should be the next president.
As you probably know, historically and traditionally, Indian Americans have been like heavily democratic leaning. But in the last several years, a lot of Indian Americans, particularly Indian immigrants who have close ties to the country, like me, uh, feel kind of betrayed. And we feel that the Democratic Party has betrayed us in the sense that they have been, we look at them or perceive them as being anti-India and anti-Hindu. And so, like for legislations like SB 403, which I feel unfairly targeted Hindus, that was brought in by a Democratic lawmaker. Now, secondly, this is something that hits too close to home. So I am from Jammu and Kashmir, and when Article 370 and 35A were revoked, Kamala Harris critically attacked or criticized the government of India for doing so. Now, that really hits uh, close to home because as a Kashmiri woman who is married, quote unquote, outside the state, 35A and 370 actually dispossessed me of all my land rights, property rights in my state, only because I was married to an outsider and I could not transfer any land or property to my children, nor could I possess it. And this applied only to women. Didn't apply to men. So Kashmiri men, which rightly it should be the case, they were free to marry anyone from any state or any country, and they would still be able to preserve their land and property rights, which seems fair. Like it is something like if I'm a woman from Wisconsin and I marry someone from Indiana or Illinois or Canada or Australia, I am dispossessed of all my land rights in Wisconsin and my children are dispossessed. So that was something for somebody who claims to be a champion of gender equity and equality. Kamala Harris are criticizing revocation of Article 370 and 35A, just listening to one side of the story, which might have been the perpetrator side, because 1990 is when my parents had to flee Kashmir because of the separatist movement and the terrorism that broke out there. I think it was very unthoughtful of her because she did not consider a Kashmiri woman like me. Also, I actually have a couple of points. There was a lot going on with 370 and 35A. It's not just the Kashmiri women, but it was also the kids of Jammu and Kashmir who were not protected against Child Marriage Act because of special provisions to the state, similar for LGBTQ community. But the thing about women hits uh, is something very personal to me. So before 2019, I could not own any property in the state that I was born and raised in, that I belonged to, but any man could. But I could not. I was not considered equal just because my husband is from New Delhi. So I could not. And it's only after 2019 that I now have what we call permanent residence of the state. And now I can own property, I can transfer property to my children, but I was barred from doing that versus my male counterparts were not. Then there is also the uh, right to, it was a domestic violence act, which was not applicable to the state. So I think it was very ignorant of her to comment on things like that without having a proper understanding. And I feel it's a lot of Indian Americans like me who feel betrayed by the Democratic Party. Yet, at the same time, I'm also not a supporter of Donald Trump, so I'm still undecided. And I can talk about why I don't support him. But this is the reason that I feel very uncomfortable supporting Kamala Harris.
Well, I mean, I'm fascinated by the layers of understanding and these dynamics because oftentimes when I talk to the pundits who are out there saying, well, issues that are happening overseas don't matter to the American electorate, but it's very clear in your case it does matter. Stan being also an attorney in what I think, after deducing this for months, I do think perhaps the most pivotal swing state of them all, Pennsylvania. I think, I when I went to Wisconsin, we covered the RNC, we covered the DNC as well. When I went to Wisconsin, I thought, wow, I think Wisconsin's the state. But after a few months and going to Pennsylvania for the Trump Harris debate, I think Pennsylvania is the state that matters the most for both these candidates. I mean, give me your perspective, Stan, and where you've been politically over the years, and why you have. I mean, have you made a decision yet?
Sure, sure. Thank you for having me, Ravi. So we've known each other a few years and kind of tracked together. So in terms of where I've been over the years, I haven't quite fit into American politics because got to take some from one side and some from the other side. That's sort of where I straddle, right? So I'm like, okay, which one do I pick? And not picking one means I don't get to participate in the early stages. So I've always been a little bit confused going back to about 2006 when I was naturalized. And then I started participating in this process. So I've been independent since then, and trending Democratic because of the social issues. But we're at a moment in time, I think, where other things matter even more, right? The geopolitical situation being one of them, and that's something that I've always been interested in. Having lived in India, having lived in Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East, and seen that through the 80s and 90s, that's a very sensitive place, right? Primarily between the Jews and the Arabs, but really explosive because of other things like oil and whatnot, right? So I've been watching that for a long, long time. And I think we're in a more sensitive place than we've ever been, right? And then combine that with Ukraine and kind of the other side of this, and then the China stuff, right? So those three things are very, very big things. I don't think have existed in the past as a thing that people even considered. But in having talked to a number of people just walking around here in Havertown, Pennsylvania, which is just a modest suburb outside of Philadelphia, the sentiment is that's kind of a big deal, right? They don't call it international relations or geopolitical whatever, but what they call it is the threat of World War III or what's going on in the Middle East and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of an important issue for me as well, because at any minute there could be major conflict, and that's not only like World War III type of consequences. It's very basic things like the price of oil. I'm surprised that the price of oil has not shot up further, because in the past, right, it would have gone up significantly. So anyway, putting that aside, the other kind of things, and so because I straddle these things, I think of more issues as opposed to parties and their platforms, right? I think of what issues do I care about as opposed to the baked things that come out of the parties. There's been an outsourcing trend, I know, since probably the early 90s when we did NAFTA, right? And that has like wreaked havoc on the American economy, in my view, not just NAFTA, but then to China and all these kind of things. And that's at an ebb now, right? And we need to, it's almost like a deglobalizing trend. And we've seen that in other parts of the world where people have objected to this kind of place that we're in. So deglobalizing, how we handle deglobalizing, how the parties think about it and look at it, in one sense, it can mean made in America becomes valuable, right? And we've seen that made in America, more and more things say made in America on it, because we don't want it made elsewhere. We want the money to stay right here. We want American workers doing it, all that kind of stuff, right? So I watch that closely, because the better economy we have, the better paid my neighbors are, the better off I am, right? It's just that simple. Then the border issue, the Mala mentioned, right? That is actually a national security issue. It's not a immigration issue. If people are coming through the borders, we're not asserting our sovereignty territorially, right? As a country, we have to do that. And so I think that's a big deal, right? Then inflation and jobs is another thing that people kind of talk about. And bringing jobs back. How will we bring jobs back? Well, if you insource and resource, right, as opposed to outsourcing, that naturally brings jobs back. We start building here, right here in America. Now, the social issues, these are important issues, right? Rights should be available to everybody, equal protection of the laws, right? Whether you're LGBTQ or black or woman, right? Everybody should have the equal protection of the law. So I care significantly about that. And then the final thing is all the basic freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. I mean, this country was founded on freedom of religion. You can barely talk about what you believe in anymore without getting, a sneering look. I'm like, which America have I come to? I immigrated here in the late 90s. I came to a vision of America that stood for these things. I look back and I'm like, where are we? Right? So these are some of the issues. Then I try to slot them into the parties and be like, okay, where are they? and I can't. Like, take this one, right? You can take half, is what they say. So that's sort of where I'm left.
I'm fascinated by all three of you and your perspectives because I do have these conversations. A lot of them are kind of, quiet, closed door conversations, folks who don't want to speak publicly about where they are politically. But I have noticed a shift, right? I think we were one of the first organizations to say, well, President Trump, going back to 2015, 2016, was starting to pull some Indian Americans into the fold, which is, again, almost an 80% voting block for the Democrats. So it is still kind of shocking to see so many folks now moving in another direction. But that being said, when I talk to Democratic bundlers and leaders, they think the majority of the community will still vote for Vice President Harris. And I think for the four of us on this video here, all of us are Indian Americans. We would think the first Indian American presidential candidate would attract all of us to just be an automatic rubber stamp for Vice President Harris. Why hasn't been an automatic rubber stamp? Is there a lack of messaging from the Harris campaign that has just given you pause? Mala, why don't we start with you?
I think it's the lack of specificity on a lot of issues. I mean, I feel like maybe earlier, when I think about my parents' generation, I do feel a lot of the early Indian immigrants were Democrat. And I think our generation here, I was born and raised in Arizona, is really divided. And there's a lot of, who's going to be better for my taxes? You got to be really clear on that. I haven't seen a strong plan from the Harris campaign yet on specifics, besides, giving small businesses loans and the down payment. So I think, that's an issue, a huge issue.
Shelley?
As far as I'm concerned, it may sound strange, but I would not consider ethnicity as a motivating factor for me to cast my vote. As I mentioned, I'm still undecided because there are a lot of Donald Trump's policies that I do not agree with. I'm all for gun control. As a healthcare provider, I believe in reproductive rights for women. I also believe that we should be doing more for the climate. And I also believe that decency plays an important role and who we are modeling for our children. Yet at the same time, I do appreciate Trump's pro-India stance. At least it seems so. And some of his policies. So I am literally undecided, and I may just decide not to vote at all. Yep. But definitely ethnicity to me would not matter. The candidate would, uh, ethnicity to me would not matter. And that may not be a lot of Indian Americans, but definitely it would not matter to me.
Stan?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I think it's a tough question. I think Mala touched on the lack of specificity and then the relations with India, I'm hearing as well. So my gut reaction is, to be fair to Kamala Harris, she didn't really have a chance to fully develop her platform, right? She suddenly got thrown this ball, and she had all of like 2 months to get everything going. So Donald Trump had a huge lead in terms of getting all of this out there, being in front of people, all that kind of stuff, right? So, but what I see with Kamala Harris, I mean, I have a flyer here. I don't want to pull out my exhibits, but the 5 boxes on there do not line up to the platform, and you're kind of left like I actually, in thinking about what we might discuss, I had gone to her website and gone to Donald Trump's website, and like there's a little bit of a gap between what she says, what the mailer says, and then what the platform says, right? So there's this discordance going on, and you're kind of left wondering, okay, what are we saying, right? And it all sounds great. It all sounds great. But she's, the other thing I think is she's caught between a rock and a hard place because she has to differentiate from Biden and at the same time be different from Trump, right? So I think all of those challenges has made it very difficult for her to really appear very firm and very clear on exactly what I'm going to do, right? And it's unfortunate that her message is not coming out as clearly, but Donald Trump's message is coming out as very clearly. I get a flyer. It has 12 things written on it. That's the same 12 things on his website. That's basically the same 12 things he talks about. And so it's the messaging is super crisp, right? And I mean, I think she has a lot of good ideas, but they're not coming through.
So speaking of President Trump, I mean, his messaging is what it is, right? We all have a sense of what he will deliver if he's back at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Obviously, there's a lot of folks that are deeply offended by most of what he has proposed. At the same time, there's a lot of folks that really appreciate the fact that he's very candid and raw and cavalier and almost off the cuff at times. And having personally interacted with the man in private. I had a chance to interview him in Bedminster a couple of years ago, and then he had a Diwali party at Mar-a-Lago, which I got invited to, and it was interesting to see his interaction with his staff, with the folks that are, basically trying to get him elected. Right? He's around a lot of people that are his support system, and both Vice President Harris and President Trump have been very gracious, at least to me. So I think that those personal engagements you have with media, that's probably not, it's a little bit different than what they're saying, on camera versus off. But Trump can be so polarizing, and yet he's still neck and neck with basically the incumbent. Vice President Harris had the advantage of getting $100 million from President Biden and basically, bypassing the primary system, right? I mean, had there been an open primary, there's no question it might have been a much more contentious situation for her. So with President Trump specifically, let's start again with Mala. Has his messaging offended you, or do you understand why he's so raw and why so many people are engaged with him?
I mean, I can definitely speak from Arizona and the contacts that I have. There's a really large rural population in Arizona that he's speaking directly to that remembers under Trump, the economy was good and business was booming and they were thriving. And in the last 3 years, 4 years, they're struggling. Their expenses are higher. They don't have a as optimistic view of the world and the economy, and a lot of their jobs have suffered. And so I think that's where he's speaking to. I had a conversation yesterday. They're like, I just need Trump to win, the economy get better, and my business to start growing. And he's speaking to that as like the great savior, you know. I think a lot of people are connecting with that message, and it's just like Stan said, it's really hard for Vice President Harris to separate herself from the Biden administration. And she said that, I believe, in the last week, that her administration will look very different, but we don't know how. And, granted, she hasn't had a lot of time to articulate that, but I think that's where Trump had a huge advantage to kind of capitalize on the kind of discord that the Biden administration had with the American people. They felt very disconnected from the Biden administration, I think. I'm not sure about in California and New York, but I definitely feel like in Central America, definitely in Arizona.
Shelley, when you hear President Trump, you mentioned earlier that you don't like what he says, quite often. Why is he still in the mix for you to potentially get your vote if you do choose to vote? Why is he still someone that you would consider?
I think because of his foreign policy, his policies towards India. My taxes were lower under Donald Trump. Uh, I am not sure about the economy because I don't know if it's COVID, if it's Trump, or what the factors were. It's more nuanced. I think that would be that would be it. But definitely, uh, to me, decency in politics and otherwise does matter, and I don't really appreciate his the way he talks. Uh, the way he would tweet. Now it's, I think, Truth Social. I'm not on any of those platforms, but I'm aware of it, and I don't particularly appreciate it. I think it's very unpresidential. I think it's very unpresidential. I do not expect the person holding the highest office in the United States to be talking like that or uh, dehumanizing people and saying things like they're eating cats and dogs and stuff like that. But maybe it's just me. But uh, But again, there are many Indian Americans that I know in Wisconsin uh, who don't care about those things. So it's very personal. So yeah.
That's a great point you bring up, because I do think maybe that may have been the difference in the last election. President Biden does come across as a very kind of avuncular man, and I think folks were looking for maybe a more uh, traditional style of leadership compared to 2016. I remember how crazy it was to get the tweets from President Trump constantly, and you're like, okay, well, do we jump and run because he's talking to North Korea over Twitter? I mean, it was wild, and it took us a few months to say, okay, if they actually shoot a missile in that direction, we'll cover it. But otherwise, some of the rhetoric we won't go crazy. But I do know a lot of the folks in the media that I know uh, don't like that approach. Right, if the president says something, it matters and it has a real meaning. Stan, your thoughts on President Trump and his messaging? Some more.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a number of things that's been raised. So I think the chaos of 2016 and 2017, that should give anybody pause to say, hey, why don't you come on over and do it again? Right? Uh, but I think, boy, that was partly his inexperience and his basically authoritarian style, which can actually be fine in a business. There's plenty of psychos running businesses or CEOs, right? But that doesn't necessarily translate into being a statesman. So I think a lot of that I read even then as this guy doesn't know what he's doing. He just got there and he's trying to find his, sea legs, right? But besides that, Shelley brought up an interesting point, which is his character, right? And so I think of this as kind of overarching pieces to evaluate both candidates. It's not just policy. So far we've talked about policy. It's character, it's communication, it's effectiveness, right? And so if you think about just those four, dimensions for each of these folks, character is a significant piece for Donald Trump because he's openly been kind of hostile, but it's win at all costs with him. So it doesn't matter what word or what phrase he uses or how he brands people. Sleepy Joe Biden, right? Marco Rubio got some of that, right? So everybody got a fair share of that. And so as an Indian American, the race piece is he's quietly back there. We're like, man, this guy, I don't know how he's going to behave on race. But then at the same time, I see Vivek Ramaswamy run around with him, and I see how he talks about stuff. I think we're grappling as a society with race generally, right? Do we call it out and we say, this is African American, or this is black, this is a black issue, or this is and then Indian Americans, and all the other minorities. We have Vietnamese Americans, Chinese Americans, right? We're all just American, right? Skin color doesn't matter, race doesn't matter, right? So I think these are fairly equal views that you can have, right? Meaning, like, I'm colorblind or I see color, and we have to, talk about color, right? So in that sense, I don't discredit him on that basis alone. Then the other thing I think about is his messaging, like the cats and dogs thing. He's a brilliant, brilliant marketer, right? And so one way to understand that cats and dogs thing, nobody was talking about anything else for the next 2 weeks. So it's a way to command attention that it's his tactic. Sleepy Joe Biden, nobody will forget it, not even the opposition, right? And all his nicknames that he throws around, it's almost like a branding tactic that he uses, and not so much what was the other, cat ladies, right? Vance was taking on this tactic. Cat ladies, immediately, we know exactly what he's talking about. I even saw a Harris sign, which had a cat on it. So imagine that. They've created a brand, and the Harris people think that they should use that on a sign, right? So I see that as kind of a tactic that they're using, but the derogatory nature of it, I just don't think it's even on Trump's wavelength, right? So that's his communication style, win at all costs, we're going to cut through everything, right? So that's what I think of Trump generally, in terms of what you were asking. Effectiveness, it was pretty good. People stopped getting their heads cut off in the Middle East. ISIS went away, right? Nobody talks about it. Even Trump doesn't talk about that. Meanwhile, Afghanistan was the noisiest exit anybody's ever seen after 20 years and trillions of dollars, right? That's a major fumble. And not only is a major fumble, it potentially signaled to Russia, hey, we don't have appetite for anything else. So go right ahead. We won't be there, right? And then maybe it signaled Iran too. Who knows, right? So foreign policy is very delicate. I think it was mismanaged by Biden, and it accrues to Harris as well.
Well, this is part of the reason I wanted to have this conversation. I'm just fascinated by everybody's perspective because there's so much to chew in on. Is there one message that can get through to you? And I understand maybe some of you have already kind of honed in on a candidate, but if they have something to say to you directly, because frankly, there hasn't been a whole lot of specific outreach to Indian American issues, which are unique, right? I mean, if you're following geopolitics, you see what's going on between India and Canada. The U.S. has a piece of that. We, as Shelley mentioned earlier, the SB 403 bill, which I think was very contentious. A lot of people underplay how serious that was, but I live in California and we cover that issue quite extensively. So some of these have an effect on this campaign. Is there something that either candidate can tell you here with just a few days to go to win your support? Mala?
I think it's going to be individual. It's going to be individual. What speaks to me, what may speak to Stan, it evolves constantly with the different, like you said, a lot of the rhetoric that comes out. And if it sometimes elevates to too offensive, right? I mean, that's going to speak to you. Or I just think it's individual. I think most people kind of know who they're leaning towards at this point, and my ballot came in the mail already last week. So people are already mailing them back. I don't think there's too much left. I think it's just about them keeping up their energy of their campaigns, but I don't see a lot of changing minds at this point late in the game. That's my opinion.
Shelley, can anyone get through to you and just make you punch that ballot box for them?
I don't know about myself, but I do know that there was this video of Donald Trump that came out where he was talking about the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi. And this was just a few days ago. I don't know where do you know what I'm talking about? That podcast that he was talking about? And I know that some people in Wisconsin who were not considering voting for him did change their mind. But again, as I said, for me, I don't know. I'm still undecided. There are many factors that I consider. And as I mentioned before, reproductive rights for women and gun control are also very important for me. I'm also a public health professional. So as a healthcare professional and also as a woman, I do believe that women should have the ability to take uh, decisions about her health with her doctor, and the government should not have any business interfering with that. So, for me, there are many factors, and that's why I truly need it when I say I am undecided and I would like to see a candidate who is not radical left or not radical right, somewhere in the middle. And honestly, I don't see any party or candidate representing me that way. But definitely, some things could make a difference to people. So on the other hand, I know about a young Indian American girl who wanted to vote for Trump, and after the cats and dogs amen, she was like, I don't think I want to vote for him. So it's very personal, as Mala rightly said. It's very nuanced and very personal, but definitely it is not as simple as Indian Americans voting for Kamala Harris for her ethnicity. Definitely that's not the case at all, as we see.
Go ahead, Stan.
So Trump is clearly the candidate for change for me, right? And change not of the last 4 years or the last 8 years, of the last 20 or even 30 years, because Biden's been there for over 30 years, right? And so the question Trump keeps asking is, why haven't you done it yet, right? And it is a legitimate question. So this is a change of the status quo in terms of the established thinking. And the established thinking has got to change in the world that we're in, just like I said. It's a multipolar world. It's no longer the U.S. is on top, whether it's militarily, economically, or whatever, right? So that shift, I don't know if that's happened yet. And Trump is kind of the leading edge of that arrow, right? It was in 2016 and it is now, right? So a number of reasons that I think that he is definitely the candidate for change and for changing the internal machinery. Let's get rid of the DOE, right? The Department of Education, all those kinds of things. Let's slash the workforce. I think that's a lot of risk with 350 million people kind of relying on them to do their job correctly. It's a lot of risk. It looks like 80 million plus Americans are willing to take that change and take that risk because of their paychecks and their economic fate over the last 20, 30 years. So besides that, when I think about Harris, um, I think Biden has actually interestingly had a number of successes. The Inflation Reduction Act. Scaramucci had talked about it a little bit at the debate. Anthony Scaramucci. The Inflation Reduction Act does quite a few things, right? The Quad talks that Biden has been holding brings India into the fold in the Pacific. It's the Indo-Pacific. Like previously, they didn't call it the Indo-Pacific. India is on the rise there, right? And India is taking its seat at the table. The number of wins that are going unannounced. But even if it were announced, I don't know if Kamala would actually take the banner on that and say, "Hey, this is my win too," because is it really? I don't know, right? So there's a solid platform that Biden is leaving behind, in the sense that he's got a number of these things under control, but I don't know that Harris is, fully capturing the value of that. I don't know how she does it either. So that's kind of what I'm looking for is like somebody to kind of step in. And the character issue and then the effectiveness and communication issue are big, right? So you can't go in public and be like, unburdened by the past and all this kind of stuff. That's kind of weird to me, right? And if we keep saying it, it's even weirder. So we need statesman-like people. That's what I'm looking for. I need a statesman. This is the United States of America. There used to be a time there were statesmen that led this country, and I think it started falling apart a while ago. I don't think it's going to change, but I'm looking for that kind of person, and I'll be watching closely.
Well, it's interesting you bring this up, and I do agree with you that I think President Biden went to India last year at the G20. I happened to attend, and they announced something called the I2U2. And there's a huge initiative, like $100 billion investment that America is going to be making between India and the Middle East all the way to Italy. And it was going to connect, Saudi Arabia. It was going to connect the UAE through Israel into Italy. And then, of course, this Hamas Israel conflict broke out just shortly thereafter. And so here we have what could have been transformational. And that was an initiative that President Biden, along with Prime Minister Modi, had agreed to. That was a huge step. I know watching it in real time, thinking, wow, this is an amazing relationship that is beginning and developing. And I did talk to Ambassador Garcetti a few months ago, who said, hey, actually, it's still on track, believe it or not, despite the conflict in the Middle East. There are back channel discussions taking place all the time about that infrastructure initiative. So certainly there are some things that the Biden-Harris administration can take credit for. And certainly we saw President Trump have a rally for 50,000 people a few years ago in Houston and going to India with 100,000 people. So I think, from that perspective, I think if you're looking at it on balance, I think both administrations, whether it's a Trump or Harris administration, would certainly want to engage India. And so the level of which is the question, because we do see these other conflicts and Bangladesh people bring up and Pakistan and how those relationships will go. It's not just strictly an Indian dynamic. So let me just get your final thoughts. I know some of you are still deciding. Some of you have made a decision. So Mala, why don't you break it down for us? Where are you leaning? In all the rhetoric you've heard, all the messaging, we're the final few days here. Where do you think you're going to cast your ballot for?
I'm leaning towards Vice President Harris right now. I see a lot of effectiveness at the border. I can't forget what a Trump administration looked like in terms of legal immigration and what it felt like in terms of the chaos. And I agree with Shelley's comment about just the impact of the words and how you mentioned like the tweets. It felt like every day on the news, you're like, oh my gosh, he did what? And I'm just not sure I'm ready for that chaos again. So I'm leaning, but yeah, I think I think Shelley made a great comment when she said, I mean, it's really poignant that she said she's still undecided, because we do have the memory of the last Trump administration, but we still, we're living in the Biden-Harris administration. And so it's really, it's like she's going to decide not to vote rather than to vote for one of the candidates that we have. That's huge in a swing state. And then when Stan said that, like, Trump represents the change, I think that's kind of where that mentality is coming from. I don't think either of these candidates represent change, because if you're, Trump, you had a chance. So why didn't you change it? And Vice President Harris, you're in there now. So I think that's the frustration of a lot of Americans, is that neither one of they're not really happy about either one, but they're trying to pick the one that they can back.
Shelley, give us your thoughts here on, where do you think you'd lean? I would certainly love to see you vote, because I think your voice is very important. We've seen that throughout this conversation. You have a very valuable voice. So what do you think? If push comes to shove, who do you think you'd vote for?
I don't know. I think Mala put it brilliantly. I'm not happy with either of the candidates, and I don't know. I'm not sure. But definitely, there is not even one candidate that I'm really excited about and do want to vote for. And I would really like to see more options in US politics. The other thing that I wanted to mention, sorry, and I think I forgot, I know about Ryan Walters in Oklahoma, who was trying to introduce Bible in public schools. So, uh, and he is a Trump supporter. And again, religion in public schools is something that I would not support, be it any religion. I think public school education should be secular. There are religious schools for that. So, like, given all of that, it confuses me all the more with both candidates. And again, for Kamala Harris, I'm saying that because she specifically commented on Article 370 and 35A, which is very personal and which affects me personally, so it's not easy for me to vote for her either. So I'm not really happy with either of the candidates, and I would like to see somebody who's more like moderate and a centrist candidate rather than extremes on either sides.
Stan.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Shelley. There's a lot of villainizing that's going on, right? So let's say the election is over, then what, right? But everybody else is disenfranchised, right? It's all Americans, it's all citizens. Whether it's the older white man. So Bernie Sanders used to talk about this. 45 to 55-year-old white men were committing suicide in higher numbers than any other segment, right? They're being disenfranchised already. Are they not citizens? Are they not important, right? Each segment of this country is important, but an excessive amount of villainizing. And it's like, well, there's not enough for everybody, so we're just going to give it to one group or something, right? That's just not true. And so, social issues are really important. There's been a lot of divisiveness. I just wish the candidates had some message around that. You don't have to duke it out and curse it out to the finish line. You can actually elevate the conversation. I just have not seen that, right? Because they're going to have to do it. January 20th, they're going to have to do it. But all that said, I think the character issue weighs significantly for me, right? And the character in the past for Donald Trump has not been great. And there's this secret other thought that I've had around Trump is he has to run. He has to win. Otherwise, he's going to jail. So it's like this underlying motivation for him. And so, I'm just not interested in that kind of stuff. And then the chaos, right? The absolute chaos. There's no guarantee against the chaos. There's no guarantee against even the orderly execution of the priorities, because it involves ripping up a lot of stuff, right? You should do it delicately. Tim Schneider over at Yale provides a great lecture online about lessons from European history. And it's worth watching, because we think that it just goes higher and higher. Democracy just goes higher and higher, but it doesn't. Sometimes it goes desperately the wrong way, and you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to wrap this conversation up because I don't think I could have found three better people to articulate the challenges of picking someone you would think you'd be excited to pick, in November, who's going to be president, and certainly Vice President Harris being Indian American, but it's not a slam dunk for her. Though obviously the polls have both Trump and Harris neck and neck, and the fact that the three of you are sitting in the most important states in the union to decide this race, I think that's why we wanted to have you all on. And thank you so much for expressing your really thoughtful insight into what you've been trying to process. And I think all of us are sitting back and trying to weigh all these different pros and cons, even in a state like mine, like California, which has a decidedly blue outcome. Certainly, some of these things like SB 403 caused a lot of folks to kind of stand up and say, "Well, wait a second, is our community being targeted?" And I think these little battles across the country are going to continue to be thought about as the community has become much more independent minding. And just to go back to that stat where President Biden had lost about 19% from last cycle, 17% were true independents. Only 2% went to President Trump. So the fact that Vice President Harris has now brought most of that community back up and then some shows that there were a lot of folks that were very upset at what had happened over the last 4 years. And so here we have a great cross section of independents around the country and understand what their needs are. And hopefully these political players in the future will definitely listen to what you guys have to say. So Mala, Shelley, Stan, thank you all so much. I really appreciate your time.